All right, thanks for having me. My name is Heiko. I'm an applied AI engineer at Google, and I work with customers to build multi-agent applications. Just a disclaimer up front, the views expressed today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of my employer. For example, I also wrote an article about how to build multi-agent systems with MCP and A2A. I wrote that, as a private person. So again, not necessarily reflecting Google Cloud's opinions today, but I have some knowledge on how to build multi-agent applications because that's what I do with a lot of customers. So first of all, what do I mean by multi-agent application? It could be something like this, right? Where a user interacts with a concierge agent or router agent, and that router agent then leverages the expertise and the capabilities of other specialist agents, and they need to communicate with each other. And these specialist agents, in turn, might use some tools via MCP. First of all, when I ask customers whether they are aware of when to put a functionality as an agent versus a tool, i.e. versus using MCP versus A2A protocol, they are not usually quite sure when to do which. So this is a non-representative poll that I did on LinkedIn, and basically I asked, do you have a good mental framework? Let's say you want to provide a functionality within your multi-agent system. Do you know when that should be an agent? When should that be a tool? And it's pretty evenly split. So 1/3 said, yeah, that's quite clear to me. But then another third said, I have no clue. And, the last third said, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And the objective of the session today is if you have similar doubts, if you ask yourself the same questions when you build a multi-agent system, should I use MCP or A2A, or when should I use which? The objective of today's session is to get you all to this first bucket of, yes, that is clear to me. But first of all, what are even these acronyms that I'm throwing around here? Who here has heard of a model context protocol? Okay, that is quite a few. So model context protocol, I'm going to oversimplify it, so hopefully no one's going to be mad at it. But my oversimplified definition of model context protocol is just an API that is made LLMable. So, you take an API, and instead of a service or a human consuming that API, you want LLM models to consume that API, so you wrap it in a model context protocol. So basically, this protocol enables large language models to use tools. And then, who has heard of the A2A or the agent-to-agent protocol? Is way fewer. So agent-to-agent protocol, by the way, MCP was introduced by Anthropic, I believe in November last year, so pretty much a year ago now. A2A protocol was introduced by Google Cloud in April this year, but in the meantime, it has been donated by Google Cloud to the Linux Foundation. So it is completely open source, just like the model context protocol is. And the A2A protocol is really for communication between two agents. If you are a large team, chances are that some people in your team or some sub-teams build agents with something like LangGraph or Crew AI, and some other teams build agents with, let's say, Agent Development Kit, which is Google's agent framework. How do they communicate with each other? A2A is basically the answer to that. And when A2A came out, everyone was like, well, what's the difference with MCP? And very quickly it became clear, okay, so A2A, agent-to-agent protocol, as it is in the name, is for agents communicating with other agents, versus MCP. MCP is for connecting agents with tools. But that doesn't give us any direction, any framework of when we should put a functionality that we want to expose into a tool versus an agent. And the analogy I like to use is, saying A2A is for connecting agents with agents and MCP is for connecting agents with tools. That's like saying motorways are for cars and train tracks are for trains. It doesn't really inform us when to use which. And when we ask ourselves, well, what is the best way to travel to Edinburgh? Then we do have a mental framework in our head of like, okay, I want to travel there, be fully flexible, and maybe, I don't want to only go to Edinburgh, but also drive around a little bit in the area. So car is definitely my choice of transport. Or I say, I don't want to deal with, any traffic. I don't have much luggage, so I'm just going to use the train. We do have a mental framework on when to use a car versus a train. But we don't really have that when it comes to tools versus agents. So what I'm going to try to cover in today's session is we are trying to build a multi-agent system. We are the architects of this multi-agent system, and we want to implement a functionality within that system for a client. And by client, I don't mean a customer, but someone who consumes that functionality. And I really liked Lucas's SWE agent that he mentioned earlier in the keynote as a good example, because a SWE agent nowadays usually is not just one agent, it's usually a multi-agent system, and I think Lucas even pointed towards that possibility to have a multi-agent system where one agent, for example, works on creating a pull request. Another agent works on writing the actual code. Then they might have a tool that can write to a file. But why is that a tool, and why is the functionality that writes the code an agent? Why is that? When do I when I build this system, when do I put a functionality into an agent versus when do I put it into a tool? That is what we're trying to determine here, and my goal is to give you some mental framework so that you can decide, just like you did with, when I asked the question how to travel to Edinburgh, you have a mental framework on how to decide whether car or train is best. Hopefully, by the end of this session, you will have a mental framework on when is it best to use an agent versus a tool. So the plan for this session is, first, we're going to have a quick look on the technical implementation of these two different protocols, MCP versus A2A. And then we are going to look at, based on this implementation, can we identify some traits and some advantages and disadvantages or trade-offs when we decide between tools and agents? And then lastly, when do I use which? So tools, which are provided by the Model Context Protocol. First of all, when we look at the implementation, they have a structured schema. If I want to use a tool that adds up two numbers, I clearly write an interface that says input is going to be two numbers, it needs to be two integers, and the output is the sum of those two numbers. If, coming back to the SWE agent example that Lucas mentioned this morning, if I want to provide and write a tool that writes some code into a file, the interface would be, the schema would be some code, some text, and a file name, for example. So that is different to A2A, which we're going to see in a minute. The second difference is tools are usually implemented, because in the end they're APIs, right? Tools are usually implemented in a one-shot fashion, meaning I send one request and I get back one response or an error if something happens, and that is the end of this transaction. If I want to retry it, I need to do it on the client side and basically implement some error handling. So tools are really transactional. They're predictable in the sense that when I send to this tool that adds up 2 numbers, when I send 2 numbers to that tool, I expect every time the same answer. They're stateless. So when I send 3 and 5 to this tool and it returns 8, and later I send 4 and 5, it will not remember that I had a call earlier that did 3 and 5. And they're deterministic, as I already mentioned. And the analogy I like to use here is the vending machine. A tool is like a vending machine. I go to that vending machine, I input some money, I press a button, and I get out a product. Agents and A2A protocol is implemented differently. First of all, it has a natural language interface. So if I wanted to provide the same functionality of adding up 2 numbers, but I want to provide that as an agent, I cannot use a structured schema like I do with MCP. Instead, what an agent expects as input is some natural language. So add up, please, the numbers 3 and 5. And it will do that. But whether that is the best way to implement this, that's questionable. The second difference to MCP is that A2A is implemented in a stateful and in a multi-stage fashion. So I send a request, but unlike with a tool where I get the response back immediately most of the time, A2A is implemented for or optimized for asynchronous workloads. So when I send a request, I don't necessarily expect the full response back. If I tell an agent, book me a flight, I don't expect that 100 milliseconds later, the entire response comes back. Instead, A2A is optimized for long-running tasks where I send a request, I get an acknowledgement back, maybe later I get an update, and there might even be room for some clarification. Agent at some point says like, do you want a morning flight or an evening flight? And I can provide that clarification before, after a while of back and forth, I do get the final response. So agents and A2A are meant for ambiguous and stateful workloads. And if a tool and MCP is like a vending machine, then you can think of A2A or an agent like a concierge. They both can give you the same result. If I want a Coke or a soft drink, I can go to a vending machine and use that vending machine to do it, or I can go to a concierge in my hotel and tell them, I want a soft drink. The difference really is that in one case, if something happens with the vending machine, the drink doesn't come out, that is now my problem. I have to remedy that somehow. Whereas with a concierge, if a concierge goes to the vending machine or to a shop in order to buy me a drink and they don't have it, they will just go to another shop. So I'm delegating in that sense. So hopefully, that already gives us a pretty good idea of when to implement a functionality as a tool versus as an agent. And just to recap or summarize all of that, we can ask ourselves 4 questions in order to decide when we want to wrap a functionality that we want to provide in an agent or tool. We can ask ourselves, should the workload, the interaction be deterministic, or do we need to account for some ambiguity within the request? Should it be a simple execution where I'm just going to send one request and I expect one response, or is it going to be a complex process? Is it going to be stateless versus stateful? Remember, tools are going to be stateless, so they will not remember what the previous request did, versus a stateful agent that not only can remember what has happened before, but might even ask clarifying questions in order to get more input from the user. And then direct control versus delegated ownership. Again, the example here would be the Coke. I have direct control over the vending machine, but that also means that if something goes wrong, I, on the client side, need to handle that error. Versus delegated ownership, if I ask an agent to do something for me, if I ask a concierge to do something for me, I expect that error handling will be happen on the server side. So with all that knowledge, let's do a little pop quiz and see if you paid attention. Agent or tool. I'm going to show you the first functionality, and hands up, please, if you think this functionality of getting the stock price of a company should be implemented as a tool. Okay, that is the vast majority. Agent. Could be an agent, but you know, it is possible for sure. If it's best practice, I don't know. Optimizing my investment portfolio. So I'm gonna, build a service that optimizes my investment portfolio, and then I'm gonna ask it, here's my assets. Please optimize that. Should that be a tool? No. Agent. Okay. We're getting somewhere. Last one. Find the cheapest flight from London to Paris. Tool. Few hands. Agent. More hands, but you can see it is not always clear cut, right? It's exactly. It could be a tool or could be an agent. So what else could you then use in order to determine what is best in your architecture? Well, what you also could have a look at the very last is who actually uses your functionality. And that might push you one way or the other in order to use MCP or A2A, expose it as a tool versus an agent. Is it some automated system like British Airways NDC or Travelport, basically that want to just find the cheapest flights and they want to do that in an automated fashion? That might push you over to, let's implement this as a tool. Or is it a user on an application like Expedia or using Google Assistant? In that case, you don't want the end user who is directly exposed to that functionality to handle with errors. So that might lean you towards implementing this functionality as an agent. Again, there's oftentimes when I work with customers, there's no clear-cut really. It's not as clear-cut as the first two examples we saw earlier, oftentimes, but sometimes it is. And more often than not, it's in the end also not a one and done decision, like it's not a final decision. You could start implementing it one way, and then over time you see that you might want to change it from tool, for example, to ATE. To an agent. Basically know your customer, know who consumes the functionality. That might also be a deciding factor for you. So just to recap, we had this framework already in our head when we are being asked how to travel to Edinburgh, what is the best way. It depends on several factors, but that one we already knew. But how to do that, how to answer a similar question if we are being asked whether a functionality should be an agent or a tool. So we looked at the different implementations of these protocols. We came up with this concierge versus vending machine framework. And then also we looked at the holistic architecture, who in your multi-agent system is actually using this functionality. You can read more about this topic. I wrote on O'Reilly an article about this, the architect's dilemma. And then finally, if you want to learn more about these kind of things, I regularly write on LinkedIn, so you can check that out as well. Thank you so much. I hope this was useful, and I think we're gonna have some Q&A now.